June 22, 1941. 3 a.m. Along a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, over 3 million German soldiers stand ready. The largest invasion force in human history is about to be unleashed. In just 2 years, Adolf Hitler had achieved what seemed impossible. Poland crushed in weeks. France, the mighty French Empire, defeated in 6 weeks. The seemingly invincible Wehrmacht stood at the gates of Britain. Nazi Germany controlled virtually all of continental Europe. Hitler stood at the peak of his power. One more victory, he believed, and the war would be won. But in the pre-dawn darkness of that summer morning, he was about to make a decision that would seal his fate and the fate of Nazi Germany. A decision so catastrophic that historians would debate it for generations. A decision that would lead to the deaths of tens of millions and ultimately cost him everything he'd gained. Today, we're diving deep into Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Not just what happened, but why this single strategic blunder doomed the Third Reich from the very moment the first shot was fired. Because this wasn't just a mistake. This was the mistake that changed the course of human history. Let's go back to the beginning. August 23, 1939. Moscow. The world watches in shock as the foreign ministers of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union sign a non-aggression pact. On paper, it's a promise, we won't attack each other. But there's a secret protocol, one that won't be revealed for decades. Hitler and Stalin, two ideological enemies who had spent years denouncing each other, had just agreed to carve up Eastern Europe between them. Poland would be split down the middle. The Baltic states would fall into the Soviet sphere. It was a deal made between devils. For Hitler, this pact was never meant to last. It was tactical, not strategic. A way to avoid a two-front war while he dealt with France and Britain. You see, Hitler had always been crystal clear about his ultimate goal, and he'd written about it years earlier in his infamous book, Mein Kampf. Lebensraum. Living space. Hitler believed the German people needed to expand eastward, into the Soviet Union, to secure agricultural land and resources. He viewed the Slavic peoples as racially inferior, the Bolshevik system as a Jewish conspiracy, and the vast territories of Russia as Germany's destiny. So when Hitler signed that pact with Stalin in 1939, he was buying time. After Poland fell in September 1939, Germany turned west. Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and then France, all fell like dominoes between April and June 1940. By the summer of 1940, Hitler controlled Europe. Britain stood alone, battered but undefeated across the English Channel. The smart move? Many of Hitler's generals believed so. Finish off Britain first. Invade the island, force Churchill to surrender, consolidate control over Western Europe, and only then consider what to do about Stalin. But Hitler couldn't do it. The Luftwaffe lost the Battle of Britain. The Royal Air Force held firm, and the planned invasion, Operation Sea Lion, was postponed indefinitely. Britain was wounded but alive, protected by the Channel and the RAF. And this is where Hitler's obsession began to override his strategic thinking. Instead of continuing to pressure Britain or focusing on the Mediterranean theater where Germany could have choked off British supply lines, Hitler's thoughts turned east. By December 1940, just months after failing to subdue Britain, Hitler issued Directive No. 21. Its codename, Operation Barbarossa, named after the medieval German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa who had launched crusades to the east. The goal was simple in concept, catastrophic in execution: crush the Soviet Union in a single, swift campaign before winter. Hitler estimated it would take just 8 to 10 weeks. His generals were more cautious but still confident. After all, they'd conquered France in 6 weeks. How much harder could the Soviet Union be? They were about to find out. So here's the question that haunts historians: why? Why would Hitler open a second front when Britain remained undefeated? Why invade the largest country on earth with winter approaching? Why make the same catastrophic mistake Napoleon had made 129 years earlier? The answer lies in a toxic combination of ideology, overconfidence, and strategic miscalculation. First, ideology. For Hitler, the invasion of the Soviet Union wasn't just military strategy, it was the fulfillment of his entire worldview. He saw it as a race war, a crusade against what he called Judeo-Bolshevism. In his twisted mind, this wasn't optional. It was Germany's destiny. Hitler told his generals that the coming war would be a war of annihilation, unlike anything they'd fought in the West. The rules of war, the Geneva Conventions, the basic standards of human decency, none of it applied. This would be a war to exterminate the Soviet political system and enslave its people. Second, overconfidence. The German military had just pulled off what seemed like miracle after miracle. Poland crushed in 27 days. France defeated in 6 weeks. Yugoslavia conquered in 11 days. The Wehrmacht seemed invincible, and its officers were intoxicated by their own success. They looked at the Soviet Union and saw weakness. And to be fair, they had reasons to believe this. Just 2 years earlier, in 1939 and 1940, the Soviet Union had struggled miserably against tiny Finland in what became known as the Winter War. Finland, a country with a population of less than 4 million, had held off the Soviet giant for months. The Red Army had looked incompetent, disorganized, and poorly led. If Finland could do that, German generals reasoned, imagine what the mighty Wehrmacht could accomplish. What they didn't fully appreciate was the context. Stalin had just finished purging his own military in the Great Terror of 1937 to 1938. He'd executed or imprisoned over 30,000 military officers, including most of his experienced commanders. The Red Army in 1940 was decapitated, demoralized, and leaderless. But by 1941, things were changing. The Soviets had learned from their failures in Finland. They were rebuilding, reorganizing, and rearming. Hitler's intelligence services knew this, but Hitler dismissed the reports. Third, strategic miscalculation. Hitler believed he had a closing window of opportunity. His intelligence told him that the Soviet Union was growing stronger. By 1942 or 1943, Stalin's military buildup would be complete. If Germany was going to strike, Hitler believed it had to be now, in 1941. There was also the matter of resources. Germany was desperately short of oil. The Soviet Union had vast oil fields in the Caucasus. Hitler believed that by conquering the Soviet Union, he'd secure the resources needed to sustain a long war against Britain and potentially the United States. His generals tried to warn him. General Franz Halder, the Army Chief of Staff, had serious doubts. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt questioned whether they had enough troops. Even Hermann Göring, usually a yes man, expressed concerns about logistics. But Hitler was adamant. He'd overruled his generals before and been proven right. Why should this time be different? On December 18, 1940, Hitler signed the final order. Operation Barbarossa would begin in May 1941. The die was cast. But then came a delay that might have saved millions of lives, or doomed millions more. April 6, 1941. Hitler's timetable for Operation Barbarossa hit an unexpected snag. Benito Mussolini, Hitler's Italian ally, had invaded Greece the previous October and gotten himself into serious trouble. The Italians were being pushed back. Worse, Britain was sending troops to help Greece. Hitler couldn't allow a British presence in the Balkans, threatening his southern flank right before invading the Soviet Union. So he made a fateful decision, postponed Barbarossa and first secured the Balkans. The Germans smashed through Yugoslavia and Greece with their usual efficiency. By the end of April, the Balkans were secured. But the campaign had cost Hitler 5 crucial weeks. Instead of launching Operation Barbarossa in mid-May when the ground was dry and summer was long, the invasion would now begin on June 22. 5 weeks. It doesn't sound like much. But those 5 weeks would prove catastrophic. You see, the German battle plan for Operation Barbarossa was predicated on speed. The Wehrmacht would use its blitzkrieg tactics, fast-moving panzer divisions supported by aircraft, bypassing enemy strongpoints, encircling Soviet armies, and driving deep into Soviet territory before winter arrived. The plan required reaching specific objectives before October, when the autumn rains would turn Russian roads into impassable mud, and before the brutal Russian winter set in by November. Those 5 weeks lost in the Balkans meant that German forces would have 5 fewer weeks of good weather. 5 fewer weeks before the mud. 5 fewer weeks before winter. At the time, it seemed like a minor inconvenience. In hindsight, it was the difference between reaching Moscow or freezing in the snow outside it. By mid-June 1941, the largest invasion force in human history stood ready. 3.8 million German troops. 3,600 tanks. 2,700 aircraft. 600,000 motor vehicles. 750,000 horses. Yes, despite all the mechanization, the German army still relied heavily on horses. The force was divided into 3 massive army groups. Army Group North would drive through the Baltics toward Leningrad. Army Group Center would push toward Moscow. Army Group South would head into Ukraine toward Kiev and eventually the oil fields of the Caucasus. German intelligence estimated the Soviets had about 150 divisions near the border. The real number was over 300. German planners estimated total Soviet strength at 200 divisions. The real number was closer to 400. But Hitler and his generals weren't worried about the numbers. They believed the Soviet forces were poorly trained, badly equipped, and incompetently led. They believed the entire rotten structure would collapse with one good kick. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, that kick was delivered. 3 million men surged across the border. The surprise was total. Stalin had received dozens of warnings that an attack was imminent, from his own spies, from the British, from defectors. He'd ignored them all. Stalin believed Hitler wouldn't attack while Britain remained undefeated. He thought the warnings were British provocations trying to drag the Soviet Union into the war. Even as German planes began bombing Soviet airfields, Stalin initially refused to believe it was a full-scale invasion. The first day was catastrophic for the Soviets. The Luftwaffe destroyed over 1,200 Soviet aircraft, most of them on the ground. Soviet communications collapsed. Command and control disintegrated. Entire armies found themselves cut off and surrounded. The German advance was stunning. Within 1 week, Army Group Center had pushed 200 miles into Soviet territory. By the end of the first month, they'd advanced over 400 miles. The panzer divisions moved so fast that infantry and supply columns struggled to keep up. In the first 3 weeks alone, the Germans claimed to have destroyed or captured 2,500 Soviet tanks, 1,400 aircraft, and killed or captured 600,000 Soviet soldiers. The Wehrmacht was achieving victories that made their conquest of France look slow by comparison. At headquarters, the mood was euphoric. Hitler's gamble seemed to be paying off. His generals started believing that maybe, just maybe, they'd actually pull this off. The Soviet Union appeared to be collapsing exactly as predicted. But there were warning signs if anyone cared to look closely. Music shifts to a more ominous tone. First, the Soviets weren't surrendering. Unlike the French, who sued for peace after 6 weeks, or the Poles, who were overrun in less than a month, the Soviets kept fighting. Even when surrounded, even when the situation was hopeless, Soviet units continued resisting. This wasn't the quick collapse the Germans had planned for. Second, the distances were mind-boggling. From the German border to Moscow is about 1,000 miles. From the German border to the Volga River is about 1,500 miles. These weren't the compact countries of Western Europe. This was a vast continental empire where space itself became a weapon. The further the Germans advanced, the longer their supply lines became. Trucks broke down. Fuel ran short. Ammunition had to be rationed. The railways used different gauges in Soviet territory, requiring conversion or different rolling stock. Third, Soviet reinforcements kept appearing. Every time the Germans destroyed a Soviet army, another one appeared to replace it. The German intelligence estimates of 200 total Soviet divisions were laughably low. The Soviets were mobilizing reserves from across their vast territory, including from Siberia and Central Asia. By August, German commanders were reporting that they'd already destroyed more Soviet divisions than intelligence had said existed in the entire Red Army. And yet, the Soviets kept coming. Fourth, the fighting was unlike anything the Germans had experienced. Soviet soldiers fought with a ferocity and disregard for casualties that shocked German veterans. Commissars shot deserters on the spot. Units fought to the death in encirclements. Stalin issued Order No. 270 in August, declaring that any soldier who surrendered was a traitor whose family would be punished. The Wehrmacht was winning tactical victories but suffering casualties at a rate they never experienced before. By the end of July, German casualties exceeded 200,000, more than the entire French campaign. But the biggest problem was starting to emerge: the weather and the calendar. July turned to August. August turned to September. The 8 to 10 week campaign that Hitler promised was already over, and Moscow was still 200 miles away. Army Group North was bogged down besieging Leningrad. Army Group South was fighting for Kiev. And here's where Hitler made his second catastrophic error, one that compounded the first. September 1941. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, stood poised to drive toward Moscow. The capital was within reach. The German generals believed that if they could take Moscow before winter, the Soviet government would collapse. But Hitler disagreed. He ordered Army Group Center to halt its advance on Moscow and divert forces south to help capture Kiev and the industrial heartland of Ukraine. His generals were furious. This was the moment. This was when they should strike for Moscow. But Hitler overruled them. He wanted the economic resources of Ukraine, the oil fields of the Caucasus, and the complete destruction of Soviet forces in the south. From a purely military standpoint, Hitler had a point. Kiev sat at the center of a huge Soviet concentration of forces. If the Germans could encircle and destroy these armies, it would be a devastating blow. And tactically, the Kiev operation was a stunning success. By late September, the Germans had encircled and captured over 650,000 Soviet soldiers in what remains the largest encirclement in military history. It was an annihilation. Hitler was vindicated, or so it seemed. But his generals knew better. They just spent 6 crucial weeks conquering Kiev when they should have been driving on Moscow. 6 weeks as summer turned to autumn. 6 weeks as the weather window closed. By the time Hitler finally authorized the resumption of the offensive toward Moscow, Operation Typhoon, as it was called, it was October 2nd. The autumn rains were already beginning. The Rasputitsa. The season of mud. Twice a year, in spring and autumn, the roads in Russia and Ukraine turned into rivers of mud. The German term was Schlammperiode, the mud period. Tanks bogged down. Trucks sank to their axles. Horses drowned in the mud trying to pull supply wagons. The mighty Wehrmacht, which had raced across hundreds of miles in weeks, was now crawling forward at a snail's pace, sometimes just a few miles per day. But still, they kept coming. By mid-October, German spearheads were within 60 miles of Moscow. Stalin prepared to evacuate the government. Panic spread through the city. Foreign diplomats fled to Kuibyshev. The Germans could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. Victory seemed so close. Just a bit further. Just a bit more. And then, in early November, the mud froze. The temperature dropped. The roads became passable again, but now the Germans faced a different enemy. Winter. The German army was not prepared for a Russian winter. This wasn't an oversight, they'd planned to win before winter arrived. But now, with the campaign dragging into its 5th month, German soldiers found themselves fighting in temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. They didn't have proper winter uniforms. The oil in their vehicles and weapons froze. Frostbite claimed thousands of casualties. Soldiers stuffed newspapers under their uniforms for insulation. They burned their own equipment for warmth. By the end of November, German casualties exceeded 700,000. Nearly 25% of the invasion force. The panzer divisions were at half strength. Infantry divisions were decimated. And still, Moscow held. The Germans launched one final desperate push in early December. Some units got to within 12 miles of the Kremlin. German officers could see the domes of Moscow's churches. But that was as far as they would get. December 5, 1941. The temperature in Moscow plunged to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The Germans, exhausted and frozen, were barely hanging on. And then, the Soviets attacked. Stalin had been husbanding reserves, fresh troops from Siberia and the Far East, soldiers who were trained and equipped for winter warfare. These weren't the disorganized, poorly led forces the Germans had faced in June. These were crack troops, and they hit the Germans like a hammer. Tokyo had confirmed that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union from the east, allowing Stalin to transfer 30 divisions from Siberia to the Moscow front. These troops, equipped with white winter camouflage, felt-lined boots, and weapons that functioned in the cold, crashed into the overextended German lines. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht was thrown back. Panicked German commanders requested permission to retreat. Hitler, in a moment of both stubbornness and strategic insight, refused. He issued a no retreat order, demanding that every position be held to the last man. Ironically, this order probably saved the German army from complete collapse. A retreat in those winter conditions, with Soviet forces in pursuit, could have turned into a rout similar to Napoleon's retreat from Moscow in 1812. But the strategic damage was done. The blitzkrieg had failed. The quick victory Hitler promised hadn't materialized. The Soviet Union hadn't collapsed. And now, Germany was locked in exactly the kind of long, grinding war of attrition it couldn't win. By early January 1942, the Soviet counteroffensive had pushed the Germans back 60 to 150 miles from Moscow. The immediate threat to the capital was over. Both sides dug in, exhausted. And in that frozen landscape, the true magnitude of Hitler's mistake became clear. The numbers tell the story. Germany had started Operation Barbarossa with finite resources. It had 3.8 million men, 3,600 tanks, and limited industrial capacity. By the end of 1941, it had lost over 750,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. It had lost over 2,700 tanks. It had lost thousands of aircraft. The Soviet Union, by contrast, had vast reserves of manpower and was evacuating and rebuilding its industry beyond the Urals, out of German reach. Soviet factories that had been dismantled and moved east were starting to produce tanks, aircraft, and ammunition at increasing rates. More critically, the United States had entered the war. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. 4 days later, Hitler, in yet another catastrophic decision, declared war on the United States. Now Germany faced not just the Soviet Union, but also the combined industrial might of America and the British Empire. The resource imbalance was staggering. Germany's annual steel production, 30 million tons. Combined US, Soviet, and British production, over 100 million tons. Hitler had gambled everything on a quick victory in Russia. He'd lost that gamble. And now, the war was unwinnable. But it would take another 3.5 years of unimaginable carnage before it ended. The war on the Eastern Front would continue for another 3.5 years. But after December 1941, Germany was fighting for survival, not victory. In 1942, Hitler tried again with a summer offensive, this time targeting the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad. It ended in disaster. The Battle of Stalingrad, lasting from August 1942 to February 1943, became the symbolic turning point of the war. An entire German army, the Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus, was encircled and destroyed. Over 300,000 German soldiers died or were captured. In 1943, the Germans tried one more offensive at Kursk, hoping to regain the initiative. It was the largest tank battle in history, and the Germans lost. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht never again launched a major offensive on the Eastern Front. From that point on, the Soviet steamroller pushed westward, slowly but inexorably. By June 1944, as the Western Allies landed at Normandy, the Soviets launched Operation Barbarossa, destroying Army Group Center and pushing into Poland. By January 1945, Soviet forces were crossing into Germany itself. On April 30, 1945, with Soviet forces literally blocks from his bunker in Berlin, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. 8 days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The cost of Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union was almost incomprehensible. Soviet military deaths, over 10 million. Soviet civilian deaths, another 15 to 20 million. Total Soviet deaths, 26 to 27 million people. German military deaths on the Eastern Front, over 4 million. This was 80% of all German military deaths in World War II. The Eastern Front wasn't just the main theater of World War II, it was, in many ways, the war itself. Cities were destroyed. Entire regions were depopulated. The cultural, economic, and human devastation was beyond calculation. And it all stemmed from that decision made in June 1941. So, was Operation Barbarossa truly Hitler's biggest mistake? Could he have won World War II if he'd made different choices? The answer is complex. Some historians argue that Hitler's biggest mistake was even starting the war. Others point to declaring war on the United States. Still others suggest that Germany's systemic problems, limited resources, fractured command structure, genocidal ideology, made victory impossible regardless of strategy. But Operation Barbarossa stands out for several reasons. First, it transformed a war Germany was winning into one it couldn't possibly win. By June 1941, Germany controlled most of Europe with minimal casualties. If Hitler had consolidated these gains, focused on defeating Britain, and avoided opening a two-front war, the outcome might have been very different. Second, the invasion violated every principle of strategy. Never fight a two-front war. Never invade Russia. Never underestimate your enemy. Never extend your supply lines beyond sustainability. Hitler violated all of these principles simultaneously. Third, the decision was driven by ideology rather than strategic necessity. Hitler didn't have to invade the Soviet Union in 1941. Stalin wasn't threatening him. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was holding. Hitler invaded because his entire worldview demanded it. This ideological blindness is perhaps the most important lesson. When ideology overrides rational analysis, catastrophe follows. Hitler convinced himself that the Soviet Union would collapse because his racist ideology told him Slavs were inferior and the communist system was weak. Reality had other ideas. The lesson for us today? Leaders who let ideology, overconfidence, or dogma override careful analysis court disaster. Whether in war, politics, business, or personal life, the moment you stop questioning your assumptions and start believing your own propaganda, you're on the path to failure. Hitler thought he was building a 1,000-year Reich. It lasted 12 years. He thought he'd conquered the Soviet Union in 8 weeks. It destroyed him in 4 years. He thought he was the greatest strategic genius of his age. He was actually the architect of his own downfall. Operation Barbarossa didn't just lose Hitler the war. It guaranteed that the war would end in total defeat, with Germany occupied, divided, and its cities in ruins. All from one decision, made in pursuit of an ideological fantasy, launched on a summer morning in 1941. If you found this deep dive into Hitler's catastrophic mistake fascinating, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming videos. We're planning a whole series on decisive moments in World War II, from the Battle of Midway to D-Day to the decision to drop the atomic bomb. Drop a comment below. What do you think was Hitler's biggest mistake? Was it Barbarossa? Declaring war on the US? Something else? I read every comment and love hearing your perspectives. And if you want to dive even deeper into World War II history, check out the video I'm linking in the description about the Battle of Stalingrad, the brutal turning point that followed from the failure of Operation Barbarossa. This video took weeks of research and production. If you want to support the channel and get early access to videos like this, plus exclusive behind-the-scenes content, check out our Patreon linked below. Hit that like button if you enjoyed this video, share it with anyone who loves history, and I'll see you in the next one. Remember, those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it. And sometimes, even those who do study it make catastrophic mistakes anyway. Thanks for watching.